Welcome to the debate. Imagine a professional walking into an advisor's office. They have like 30 years of complex experience, a flash drive loaded with 10,000 scattered files, and maybe 3 different AI-generated resumes that do not sound like them at all.
Right, and probably a vague, persistent memory of saving their last company from operational collapse, right?
Exactly. They sit down, look across the desk, and want to capture all of it right then and there. I mean, where do you even begin without drowning?
Yeah, you are describing a very real, very human panic. People want their entire story told, and they want it told immediately. But the moment you try to process, 3 decades of nuanced workflow and stakeholder politics in a single sweep, the whole apparatus breaks down.
Which brings us directly to the methodology of capturing the record. Specifically, the foundational concepts we see in the Living Professional Record Academy material. We are looking at a strict operational doctrine for untangling that massive professional history.
Untangling it by, well, heavily restricting it.
Right, by starting small. So the central question we are exploring today is this. When building a living professional record, does the core doctrine to start small enough to finish, by deliberately isolating just one single role, one project, or one work product, actually create a rigorous, usable foundation for professional truth?
Or does that extreme isolation risk divorcing the evidence from the broader context required to accurately define a professional's actual contribution?
Exactly. Now, I will argue that a strictly bounded capture scope is an absolute operational necessity. It's the only way to achieve governed capture. By starting small, you ensure a secure, structured foundation before any professional claims are rendered.
And I will be taking the stance that while preventing overwhelm is, a practical necessity, hyper-focusing on one isolated fragment actively threatens the fundamental rule of this methodology, which is that evidence needs context. If an advisor restricts the scope too tightly, they sever the work from its environment.
But let me lay out why this bounded approach is so crucial. Because I have to admit, when I first encountered this doctrine, I rebelled against it a bit. It feels unnatural to ignore, 99% of your career to focus on one single spreadsheet or one isolated project rollout.
It feels reductive.
It feels very reductive. Until you sit in the room with the alternative. Many clients want to start with everything. Their whole career. Every role, every resume bullet, every file, every story.
And that usually creates overwhelm.
Immediate, paralyzing overwhelm. The brain simply isn't built to dump 15 years of nuanced workflow into a single structured session. A good first capture scope is specific, meaningful, safe, evidence-rich enough to work with, and small enough to complete.
Okay, but
You really have to start with one recent project, one role, one transition season, one recurring responsibility, one strong resume bullet, one work product, one client-safe example, or even just one AI-generated claim to verify.
I understand the instinct, but
The first record does not need to be complete. It needs to be usable. You have to start small enough to finish, apply your evidence inventory framework, and secure a foundation. Capture first, claim later, render last.
I look at the mechanics of this from a different angle. The doctrine of starting small solves the psychological problem of overwhelm, yes. But professional work is not an assembly line where you can just pull one discrete widget off the belt and examine it in a vacuum.
Well, it's not a widget, but
It is an ecosystem. If you apply that operational constraint too strictly, you are artificially severing that one project from the environment that created it. Structure without accurate meaning is dangerous.
I don't see isolation as a distortion of the truth, though. I see it as the only mechanism that allows for precise measurement of truth.
How so? When we reconstruct the context around a piece of evidence, we are supposed to identify the before condition, the after condition, the constraints, and the trade-offs. If you are only looking at one tiny fragment of work, you risk losing sight of the macro constraints.
Let's move away from the theory and look at the actual mechanics of reconstructing context. We have a framework for this, right? Before, after, and difference. You have to extract a specific bounded sample of work to measure it accurately.
Like taking a water sample instead of testing the whole ocean?
Exactly. Let's say we isolate one specific work product, an onboarding checklist. By bounding the scope strictly to that checklist, the advisor can cleanly ask the client, what was the situation before this checklist existed? What was different after you implemented it?
Right. Was the process clearer? Was it faster?
Yes. If you let the client start talking about the entire HR department's 5-year trajectory, you completely lose the ability to accurately define what they actually fixed or clarified with that specific artifact.
See, taking a single gear out of a mechanical watch and measuring it with calipers will give you a very precise understanding of that gear, but it tells you absolutely nothing about whether that gear actually turned the hands of the clock.
But you have to measure the gear first.
You can't understand the mechanism without seeing what the gear is connected to. The methodology explicitly warns us that role clarity needs contribution truth. Let's expand your onboarding checklist scenario, because this is where the isolation doctrine falls apart in practice.
Okay, let's hear it.
Picture a company that just went through a massive, chaotic merger. The HR department is bleeding talent, stakeholders are screaming about conflicting policies, and everyone is duplicating work. If a client says, I built this onboarding checklist, and the advisor is hyper-focused on this one bounded work product, they might simply record, client drafted and edited a checklist.
Well, that is an accurate verb. The text demands we use the accurate verb, not the biggest, most impressive-sounding verb we can invent.
Is it the complete accurate verb, though? To get that checklist approved and adopted in a post-merger environment, the client likely had to navigate high turnover, soothe rival managers giving contradictory instructions, and, align hostile stakeholders across 3 different time zones.
That's true, but
Understanding whether they merely edited a Word document or whether they influenced without authority and resolved a political deadlock requires looking at how that single project interacted with their simultaneous duties. If you bound the scope too tightly to the artifact itself, you miss the judgment the professional applied. The record must preserve judgment.
how do you measure the wear and tear on that watch gear if you don't take it out of the watch?
The framework we use to inventory evidence doesn't just ask, what document did you type? It explicitly prompts the advisor to ask what decision they made. What trade-off did you face? What constraint shaped this specific work?
And I'm saying those constraints are often external to the bounded project.
But you don't need to examine the client's entire week or the entire geopolitical landscape of the merger to answer those questions about the checklist. You just need to be rigorous about the checklist itself. Bounding the scope forces the client to anchor their memory to a specific event, which protects them from a massive danger.
Which is?
The inflation of vague claims.
Well, clients certainly have a tendency to merge their successes into a generalized feeling of competence.
Right. Which makes measuring their actual impact nearly impossible without strict boundaries. Let's look at how we establish measure clues. A clue is not a metric until it is supported. Imagine a client trying to capture a whole season of work broadly without the operational constraint of starting small.
They'll conflate the numbers.
They will inevitably conflate numbers. They will merge the volume of support tickets they handled in Q1 with the efficiency gains they achieved in Q3, and suddenly you have a massive, unsupportable metric that sounds great but falls apart under scrutiny.
Sure, I agree that's a risk.
By confining the capture session to one bounded assignment, like one rollout, the advisor asks precise questions. How many people were involved in this specific rollout? How long did this specific process take before versus after? Bounding the scope forces discipline.
That assumes the isolated measurement is actually telling the truth about the professional's impact. Let's dig into a scenario where a narrow scope distorts the truth in the opposite direction.
Okay.
We need to evaluate the difference a professional made. Do they make things clearer, faster, safer? Let's say a client automated a daily reporting process. If you only look at that specific process in a vacuum, the measure clue is overwhelmingly positive.
Right. They took a manual task that took 4 hours and turned it into a script that runs in 4 seconds.
Exactly. Massive time saved. Faster, better.
A perfect example of a bounded success.
Until you look at the broader ecosystem. What if that manual 4-hour process forced the analyst to actually read the data, which acted as a critical, unwritten compliance check?
Oh, wow.
Right? By automating it, the client made the report faster, but they bypassed a compliance step. 3 months later, the company gets hit with a massive downstream regulatory fine because the automated script was silently passing corrupted data.
Well, that's...
If the advisor maintains a rigidly narrow scope, they capture a highly positive measure clue for that one script. They write down saved 4 hours a day, but they fundamentally misinterpret the actual value of that work. A localized efficiency can be a systemic disaster.
Translating raw evidence into a concrete claim does not mean we ignore the failures or the complex realities. In fact, the process of summarizing evidence into a claim specifically includes a category for items that need more context or items that must be carried forward to another session.
But you have to know you need that context to flag it.
The bounded scope isn't saying ignore the rest of the world forever. It is saying capture this one piece of reality securely today, which leads us directly to the most critical reason why starting small is an unyielding operational rule.
Data security.
Yes. You want to open the lens wide to catch that downstream compliance issue. You want to map the whole ecosystem. But the moment you open the lens that wide, you hit an absolute brick wall of liability. Privacy begins at capture.
The tension between thoroughness and data security.
It is more than tension. It is a hard limit. We are dealing with real professionals handling proprietary, confidential, and sometimes classified material. The methodology is definitive here. Proof is not permission.
No, it absolutely isn't.
If you attempt a full career capture, or even a highly integrated multi-departmental capture to satisfy that need for broad context, the sheer volume of data makes it impossible to govern. The cognitive load of redacting an entire ecosystem on the fly is beyond human capacity.
I will concede that the mechanics of data reduction are infinitely easier to manage in small, controlled scopes. The risk of data spillage is not theoretical.
Exactly. Starting small, explicitly picking one client-safe example, allows the advisor to apply privacy boundaries immediately and accurately. You can sit down and say, for this one specific project, what must be redacted? You can only build a secure, governed context brief if you have rigorously bounded the information you are processing.
Privacy dictates a small scope, but the reality of the material we are capturing often resists it. Clients do not usually walk in with perfectly preserved, client-safe PDFs of their best work.
Right, unfortunately.
They walk in with imperfect evidence. They have memories, old handwritten notes, vague feedback, and private stories. The methodology acknowledges that these memory-based entries absolutely belong in the private record, provided they are given the correct status. But isolating a single event makes a fragile memory even weaker.
I don't follow. How bounding the scope weakens a memory? I mean, it should focus it.
It removes its structural supports. If you only have a memory of an event and you isolate it completely from the concurrent work happening around it, corroboration becomes incredibly difficult. You can't cross-reference a memory against the timeline of other projects.
Okay, I see what you mean.
More importantly, if you narrow the scope too much, you miss the wider witnesses. We are supposed to ask, who saw this work? Who relied on the result? If you are hyper-focused on the creation of one isolated task, you might only identify the client's direct manager as a witness.
Right, but who else would there be for an isolated task?
Well, if you look at the adjacent context, you might realize a peer in a completely different department relied on that work and could verify the claim. We might discover the very artifacts needed to provide confirmation.
Such as?
Like an email thread from the legal department proving a checklist was adopted globally, or a calendar invite showing cross-departmental training. If you put blinders on the client and say, we are only talking about the creation of the checklist, they won't even think to mention the deployment of it downstream.
But that is exactly the mechanism working as intended. If a memory-based claim cannot be verified within its bounded scope, it should remain marked as needing confirmation.
Even if the proof is sitting right next to it.
We are explicitly told not to pretend memory is the same as verified proof. We cannot borrow false credibility from adjacent projects just to prop up a weak memory of a specific event. We mark it. We say, this is a memory-based entry. We leave the claim as needing confirmation.
I am not advocating for borrowing false credibility. I am pointing out that the rigid enforcement of a narrow scope might actively blind the advisor and the client to the existence of valid verifying artifacts that sit just outside the arbitrary boundary they drew.
The prompts we use to inventory the evidence are designed to push past that boundary naturally. Who used the output? What changed after your involvement? You don't need to define the scope broadly to ask penetrating questions about the small scope.
I suppose that depends on how skilled the advisor is at asking those questions.
True. But I think this reveals a fundamental difference in how we view the final output of this capture phase. I view the output exactly as it is defined, a structured source entry. It is not a finished resume bullet. It is not a polished, public-facing story that encompasses their whole professional identity.
No, it's the raw material.
Right. It is simply a secure foundation. And to build a foundation, you have to pour the concrete one square at a time. Starting small enough to finish is the only sustainable method to transition a client from a state of scattered fragments into a structured, privacy-safe source entry. If you don't bound the scope, you cause overwhelming gridlock.
The output is a source layer, not a polished surface. On that, we are completely aligned. But my caution remains, while bounding the scope is a necessary starting point to prevent gridlock, advisors must remain hyper-vigilant about the dangers of reductionism.
Because of the macro context?
Yes. Isolating a single project must never be an excuse for ignoring the macro context that gave the project its meaning. True role clarity, contribution truth, and accurate analysis inherently rely on understanding the broader professional ecosystem. A gear does not turn in a vacuum.
We may weigh the risks of that reductionism differently, but we clearly share an absolute commitment to the overriding doctrine of this phase. Capture first, claim later, render last. The goal right now is not to jump to impressive resume language.
No, the goal is to build that foundational source layer that all later renderings must answer to.
Exactly. And we share the conviction that proof is not permission. Whether an advisor attempts to capture a little or a lot, privacy begins at capture. That is non-negotiable.
Absolutely non-negotiable.
There is an immense amount of complexity left to explore here, particularly how these isolated context briefs eventually bridge into the claim mapping phase. It leaves us with a fascinating puzzle about how to map a sprawling, interconnected career without losing the granular, verifiable truth.
It makes you look at every single bullet point on your own professional profile and wonder what vital context was stripped away just to make it fit on the page.
It really does. Which brings us back to the professional sitting across the desk, completely overwhelmed by 30 years of history. You cannot process it all at once. You have to find one specific, meaningful thread, one safe, evidence-rich starting point, and follow it carefully. The question for our listeners to consider is this. When you look at the massive, interconnected ecosystem of your own professional history, what is the one specific, bounded piece of evidence you would pull first to begin capturing your truth?